out later, is perspectivalism. It may all have a meaning and purpose, but almost each coherent and literate historian will attribute a different one to it. Carlyle leaves many of those problems unresolved, but in his idea of open-mindedness towards the text and towards history and towards historical documentation, there is something extraordinarily liberating. History is regarded as a subject by many people as a bore, something to get through, something which isn't really alive, something that doesn't relate to them. The interesting thing about him is his belief in its living quality. These people are speaking ethical lessons to us from the past, but they're as alive as we are now. Now, as he became the sage of Victorian England, and as he excoriated Victorian capitalism and laissez-faire individualism more and more, many of his more liberal-minded friends from the early days began to move away from him. It's important also to realise that by the middle of his life, he was a cultural lion. He knew virtually everybody who was of any significance in the culture of his day. Dickens used to carry around a multi-volume set of the French Revolution, and once told a friend, when I want to think something, I just fish it out and have a look at one of the volumes. It had a sort of totemic effect on many people in the era in which he was alive. And bearing in mind, this is a man who would later be cynically put down by the Bloomsburyite group at the beginning of the 20th century as an uneducated Scotch peasant lecturing to the rest of us on the basis of his extreme Protestant morality. Carlyle became a partly demonic figure in the 20th century because he's regarded as proto-fascistic. The last book Hitler ever read was his volume, the 8 or 6 volume history of Frederick the Great. 6. And Frederick the Great's ability amidst chaos on the battlefield to construct endless forms of order. The interesting thing about Carlyle is he thinks that micrologically and at the lowest possible level, at a grain of sand, the universe entire is revealed. So an individual decision made by a general or monarch on a battlefield has relevance to the way in which you make decisions about the ordering of energy in society way outside of the area of the battlefield, or even the war that they're actually fighting, the result of which, to his way of thinking, is often less important than the cardinal or ordinating or prior principle which an authoritarian leader of genius brings to the chaos of creating new forms. In a way, he has a sort of Titanic and Olympian view. He's less concerned about the ideological niceties of Oliver Cromwell, of Mohammed, of Shakespeare as a cultural leader, than their ability to corral and restore, to give energy to certain circumstances, to bring energy to fruition in text and human behaviour. One of the reasons why the postmodernists and post-structuralists who are a school in late 20th century academicism, particularly in the arts, like him, is because of his open-mindedness to the interconnection between texts and life, and the ability to see text as living and volcanic documents. During his high middle period, he produced a whole series of texts, such as Past and Present, and Heroes and Hero Worship, and latter-day pamphlets, in which he looked at almost every element of contemporary Victorian life. He looked at slavery, he looked at democracy, he looked at imperialism, he looked at the emancipation of women, he looked at extremities of poverty and wealth, he looked at industrialisation and laissez-faire economics, which was then becoming de rigueur. He believed that the modern world would become atomised, would become spiritless, would become falsely individualist, would become completely material, and would lose its connection with what he perceived of as the divine. His attitude towards religion is complicated, deeply personal, rooted, and idiosyncratic. He does believe in a spiritual dimension beyond life, which he believes he's actually experienced in a personal revelation. He could have only experienced this as a personal revelation because, in a sense, such a viewpoint is so personal that its truth positive can't really be communicated. The effects of that experience on Carlyle, the belief that everything is interconnected, means that the smallest and the highest moment are of equal significance to the possibility of the whole, even in their inequality. He believes that unfairness and inequality are rooted as part of nature and natural becoming. Does he believe that God is nature? Not entirely. He's not totally pagan in that way. His conception, as far as I can see it, is a metaphysical objectivism where there are certain criteria, beauty, truth, justice, that lie outside man and prior to man. and that, like most of the religious thinkers of the past, these are objective in that they are not perspectival and they can't be reduced to contemporary human standards. But very like Nietzsche, in a way, the way in which we perceive these absolutes, the full knowledge of which we can't have any idea of in our own personhood, in our own individuality, is to struggle towards truth and becoming in the moment in which we find ourselves. When the peasant demands bread at the height of the riots, when the physiocratic economic system was collapsing, just so prior to the revolution in 1789, he is demanding, in Carlyle's view, justice in his society. The point of aristocracy is to rule in accordance with laws and the development of the creative evolution of human society. If a ruling group fails in its obligation to rule, all the privileges and the flummery that go with it, which means very little to a Spartan conscience like him, goes by the way, and they're cast aside by history, and a new group is brought in. Carlyle is not a conservative, but in some respects is a revolutionary conservative of a sort. So the idea that a leadership can fail and needs to be dispensed with, the opposition in a sense to what you might call an English Tory view, that no matter how bad it is, a leadership should always be kept going because it's bound to be slightly better than what might replace it. Tolstoy's view that revolutionaries are always the worst because they come to power new and hungry and you don't quite know what they're going to do. Carlyle believes in the prospect of absolute change, but it's change rooted in tradition, which if it devours its own children, like the Greek Titans, will prove to be worthless in the way that the Montagnards were useless and worthless, in his opinion, at the end of the French Revolution. The Montagnards are the mountain in the Convention, the most revolutionary of the French revolutionary assemblies. The first was the ancient monarchical regime, the ancient regime of its estates. You had the Third Estates with the First Assembly. Then you had the Constitutional Assembly morphing into the Legislative Assembly. Then you had the French Assembly to this day, it's called the National Assembly, of course, and it's rooted in the ideas of this period. Then you have the Convention, the one that all students of this period, if they ever read this period at school, understand. The Convention consists of the moderate revolutionaries to one side of the chair, the right, the centre sweeping into the left, and the extreme left. It were called the Mountain because they had the highest seats. And in the highest seats there was Maximilien Robespierre, there was Danton, there was Desmoulins, there was Couthon, there was Saint-Just. There were the others, the terrorists. Robespierre began with a pamphlet saying he abhorred the death penalty and ended up synonymous with its use. At the high point of the terror, 1,200, 1,400 were being physically guillotined in the centre of Paris, including many of his old revolutionary colleagues. And he would stand there with a perfumed handkerchief and mop his brow and mop his mouth and say, "It's for progress. It's for liberation. It's for France." Because don't forget, many of the forms of extreme leftism that existed at that time were infused with nationalism and with national power. Until the middle of the 19th century, certain liberal ideas and nationalism, of course, went together against traditional, conservative, monarchical forms of order. Within decades, conservative nationalism and liberalism would have become dire political enemies. Carlyle is writing at a time not of confusion, but of voltaic energy and becoming. His revisionism about Cromwell is truly extraordinary, because Cromwell was unbelievably hated at the time that he began on Oliver Cromwell's speeches and his attempt to exemplify them. It's interesting the way he often deals with texts. In Sartor Resartus, there's a sort of text which he stands to one side of, plunges into the middle of. His transubstantiatory religious experience at the Leith Walk is actually deeply embedded in the middle of that text, but it's presented in some ways as though it's happened to somebody else. In his book on slavery, it's a document that's left for somebody else to find. These are extraordinarily modernist and postmodernist experiments in using your own voice, throwing your own voice as a form of cultural ventriloquism, speaking through other people. In the French Revolution, he allows everyone to act. Do you remember those old films of the Soviet Revolution by Eisenstein and these sorts of pieces? They're almost like puppet films. They're amazing in silence. So you have the masses speak and they wave their fists in the air and then they run in one direction. On Battleship Potemkin, the soldiers run in another area and so on. It's almost as if there's an attempt to make Marxist theory and the idea of historical progress real at the point